The history of Christianity concerns the Christian religion, Christian countries, and the Christians with their various denominations from the first century to the present. Christianity originated with the ministry of Jesus, a Jewish teacher and healer who proclaimed the imminent kingdom of God and was crucified c.A.D. 30 in Jerusalem in the Roman province of Judea. His followers believed that, according to the Gospels, he was the Son of God and that he died for the forgiveness of sins and was raised from the dead and exalted by God and will return soon at the inception of God's kingdom. The earliest followers of Jesus were apocalyptic Jewish Christians. Christianity remained a Jewish sect for centuries, diverging gradually from Judaism over doctrinal, social, and historical differences. Christianity spread as a grassroots movement that became established by the 3rd century. The Roman Emperor Constantine I became the first Christian emperor and in 313 issued the Edict of Milan expressing tolerance for all religions, thereby legalizing Christian worship. Various Christological debates about the human and divine nature of Jesus occupied the Christian Church for 3 centuries, and 7 ecumenical councils were called to resolve them. Christianity played a prominent role in the development of Western civilization in Europe after the fall of Rome. In the early Middle Ages, missionary activities spread Christianity towards the West and the North. During the High Middle Ages, Eastern and Western Christianity grew apart, leading to the East-West Schism of 1054. Growing criticism of the Roman Catholic Church and its corruption in the late Middle Ages from the 14th to 15th centuries led to the Protestant Reformation and its related reform movements, which concluded with the European Wars of Religion. In the 21st century, Christianity has expanded throughout the world. Today, there are more than 2 billion Christians worldwide, and Christianity has become the world's largest religion. Within the last century, the center of growth has shifted from west to east and from north to the global south. Christianity originated in 1st century Judea from a sect of apocalyptic Jewish Christians within Second Temple Judaism. The basic tenets of the Jewish religion during this era were ethical monotheism and the Torah, or the Mosaic Law. In this period, the temple in Jerusalem was still central to Judaism, but synagogues were also established as institutions for prayer and the reading of Jewish sacred texts. The Hebrew Bible developed during the Second Temple period as the Jews decided which religious texts were of divine origin. Early 1st century Christians primarily referenced the Septuagint version of the Hebrew Scriptures as it is written in Greek. The religious, social, and political climate of 1st century Roman Judea and its neighboring provinces was extremely diverse, characterized by socio-political turmoil, with numerous Judaic movements that were both religious and political. The Jewish Messiah concept, promising a future anointed leader, Messiah or king, from the Davidic line, developed in apocalyptic literature produced between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century BCE. The Christian gospel came into a Roman Empire which had only recently emerged from a long series of civil wars, and which would experience 2 more major periods of civil war over the next centuries. This period saw the growth of the cult of the emperor, which regarded the emperor as the elect of God. Romans of this era feared civil disorder, believing it produced anarchy, giving their highest regard to peace, harmony, and order. In order to reinforce order, society's class boundaries, which were most obvious in the courts where advantages and disadvantages based on class or convention, were turned into legislation. Status, and the pursuit of status through wealth and the accumulation of possessions, was the pattern of Roman life. Piety equaled loyalty to family, class, city, and emperor, and it was demonstrated by loyalty to the practices and rituals of the old religious ways, not by the individual faith of Christianity. The main sources of information regarding Jesus' life and teachings are the 4 canonical Gospels, and to a lesser extent the Acts of the Apostles and the Pauline epistles. Virtually all scholars of antiquity accept that Jesus was a historical figure. An approximate chronology of Jesus can be estimated from non-Christian sources and confirmed by correlating them with New Testament accounts. Jesus was most likely born between 7 and 2 BC and died 30-36 AD. The baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist can be dated approximately from Josephus's references Antiquities 18.52, to a date before AD 2835. Amy Jill Levine says there is a consensus of sorts on the basic outline of Jesus' life. Most scholars agree that Jesus was baptized by John, debated with fellow Jews on how best to live according to God's will, engaged in healings and exorcisms, taught in parables, gathered male and female followers in Galilee, went to Jerusalem, and was crucified by Roman soldiers during the governorship of Pontius Pilate 2636 CE. According to the Gospels, Jesus is the Son of God who was crucified CAD 3033 in Jerusalem. His followers believed that he was raised from the dead and exalted by God, heralding the coming kingdom of God. Jesus had urged his followers to worship God, act without violence or prejudice, and care for the sick, hungry, and poor. He had also criticized the hypocrisy of the religious establishment which drew the ire of the authorities. The Talmud says Jesus was executed for sorcery and for leading the people into apostasy. Early Christianity is generally reckoned by church historians to begin with the ministry of Jesus c. 2730 and end with the First Council of Nicaea 325. It is typically divided into two periods: the Apostolic Age t. 30-100, when the first apostles were still alive, and the Ante-Nicene period c. 100-325. The Apostolic Age is named after the apostles and their missionary activities. The earliest followers of Jesus were a sect of apocalyptic Jewish Christians within Second Temple Judaism. While there is evidence supporting the presence of Gentiles even in the earliest Christian communities, Acts 10, most early Christians, such as the Ebionites, were still actively Jewish. The early Christian community in Jerusalem, led by James the Just, brother of Jesus, was singularly influential. According to Acts 9, they described themselves as disciples of the Lord and followers of the way, and according to Acts 11, a settled community of disciples at Antioch were the first to be called Christians. Christianity gradually grew apart from Judaism for several reasons. Jerusalem fell to the Romans, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Christianity did not support the Jews in their rebellion against Rome, and blamed Judaism's rejection of Jesus for the temple's destruction. The 4th century church fathers Eusebius and Epiphanius of Salamis cite a tradition that before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Jerusalem Christians had been warned to flee to the mountains in the north, Mark 13:14, but instead they went to Pella in the east in the region of the Decapolis across the Jordan River, although the historicity of Christians in this location is also heavily debated. Early Christianity spread to pockets of believers among Aramaic-speaking peoples along the Mediterranean coast and also to the inland parts of the Roman Empire and beyond, into the Parthian Empire and the later Sasanian Empire. In the later Sasanian Empire, including Mesopotamia, which was dominated at different times and to varying extent by these empires. During the rise of Christianity in the 1st century CE, new scriptures were written in Koine Greek. Christians eventually called these new scriptures the New Testament and began referring to the Septuagint as the Old Testament. New Testament books already had considerable authority in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. Even in its formative period, most of the books of the NTA that were seen as scripture were already agreed upon. Linguistics scholar Stanley Porter says evidence from the apocryphal non-gospel literature is the same as that for the apocryphal gospels. In other words, that the text of most of the Greek New Testament was relatively well established and fixed by the time of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There were disputes over the time of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There were disputes over the canonicity of some texts, such as the Epistle to the Hebrews, the Epistle of James, the 1st and 2nd Epistle of Peter, the 1st Epistle of John, and the Book of Revelation. The list of books included in the Catholic Bible was established as canon by the Council of Rome in 382, followed by those of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397. Spanning 2 millennia, the Bible has become one of the most influential works ever written, having contributed to the formation of Western law, art, literature, literacy, and education. The Ante-Nicene period, literally meaning before Nicaea, was the period following the Apostolic Age down to the First Council of Nicaea in 325. During this period, Christianity was mostly seen as odd, but also as disruptive, and by some as a threat to Romanness. Christianity was mostly tolerated, but also persecuted, though persecution tended to be localized actions by mobs and governors until Christianity reached a critical juncture in the mid-3rd century, beginning with less than 1,000 people. By the year 100, Christianity had grown to perhaps 100 small household churches consisting of an average of around 200 members each. It achieved critical mass in the 100 years between 150 and 250, when it moved from fewer than 50,000 adherents to over 1 million. This provided enough adopters for it to be self-sustaining and create further growth. Rodney Stark estimates that Christians made up around 1.9% of the Roman population in 250. That year, Decius made it a capital offense to refuse to make sacrifices to Roman gods. The majority of scholars see Decius's decree as a requirement applied to all the inhabitants of the empire, but they also see it as possible he intended it as an anti-Christian measure. Still, Decius did not outlaw Christian worship. Valerian pursued similar policies later that decade. These were followed by a 40-year period of tolerance known as the Little Peace of the Church. Scholars generally agree there was a significant rise in the absolute number of Christians in the 3rd century. Stark, building on earlier estimates by theologian Robert M. Grant and historian Ramsay MacMullen, estimates that Christians made up around 10% of the Roman population by 300. The last and most severe official persecution, the Diocletianic persecution, took place in 303-311. Gerd Thiessen writes that church leadership in primitive Christianity transformed from itinerant preaching into resident leadership, those located in a particular community over which they exercised leadership, laying the foundation for the church structure that followed. Episcopoi were overseers, bishops, and presbyters were generally elders or priests. Deacons served. However, the terms were sometimes used interchangeably, following the administrative pattern set by the empire. The territory administered by a bishop came to be known by its ordinary civil term, diocese. The bishop's actual physical location within his diocese was his seat, or see. A study by Edwin A. Judge, social scientist, shows that a fully organized church system had evolved before Constantine and the Council of Nicene. The earliest Orthodox writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, outside the writers of the New Testament itself, were first called the Apostolic Fathers in the 6th century. The title Church Father is used by the Church to describe those who were the intellectual and spiritual teachers, leaders, and philosophers of early Christianity. Writing from the 1st century to the close of the 8th, they defended their faith, wrote commentaries and sermons, recorded the creeds, church history, and lived exemplary lives. Early Christian communities were highly inclusive in terms of social stratification and other social categories. Paul's understanding of the innate paradox of an all-powerful Christ dying as a powerless man created a new understanding of power and a new social order unprecedented in classical society. Historian Raymond Van Dam says conversion produced a fundamental reorganization in the ways people thought about themselves and others. Women were able to negotiate an expanded role in society that was not available in the current forms of Judaism or Romanism. Prior to Christianity, the wealthy elite of Rome mostly donated to civic programs designed to elevate their status. Christians, on the other hand, offered last rites to the dying, buried them, distributed bread to the hungry, and showed the poor great generosity. An important cultural shift took place in the way Christians buried one another. They gathered unrelated Christians into a common burial space. Then commemorated them with homogeneous memorials and expanded the commemorative audience to the entire local community of co-religionists, thereby redefining the concept of family. Classic scholar Kyle Harper says Christianity not only drove profound cultural change, it created a new relationship between sexual morality and society, replacing the ancient system where social and political status, power, and the transmission of social inequality to the next generation scripted the terms of sexual morality. There are risks in overestimating the change in old patterns Christianity was able to begin bringing about. But there are risks, too, in underestimating Christianization as a watershed. 1418. The Bauer Ehrman thesis states that Christianity of the 2nd and 3rd centuries was highly diverse, that its heretical forms were early, widespread, and strong, and that orthodoxy came later when the Roman Church enforced conformity to its views. It is the prevailing paradigm in popular American culture, but it is not agreed upon by the majority of scholars. Unambiguous evidence in Ephesus and Western Asia Minor has demonstrated that heresy in these regions was neither early nor strong, that it was preceded by orthodoxy, and that orthodoxy was numerically larger. The earliest writers shared core beliefs on doctrine, ethos, fellowship, and community, and many doctrinal tenets such as monotheism, Jesus as Christ and Lord, and the gospel as a message concerning salvation. In the early centuries, a powerful, united Roman Church, capable of enforcing its will, did not yet exist. According to Michel R. Salzman, 4th century empire featured sociological, political, economic, and religious competition, producing tensions and hostilities between a large number of various groups. Christians described themselves as triumphant and focused on suppressing heresy. 407. Constantine became the Roman Empire's first Christian emperor in 312, but how much Christianity he adopted at this point is difficult to discern. Constantine was over 40, had most likely been a traditional polytheist, and according to historian Peter Brown, was a savvy and ruthless politician when he declared himself a Christian. Although he was not baptized until shortly before his death, he pursued policies that were favorable to Christianity and played an active role in the leadership of the Church. Contemporary scholars are in general agreement that Constantine did not support the suppression of paganism by force. However, Constantine wrote laws that threatened and menaced any who continued to practice sacrifice. There is no evidence of any of the horrific punishments ever being enacted. There is no record of anyone being executed for violating religious laws before Tiberius II Constantine at the end of the 6th century. 574. 582. Constantine did not stop the established state support of the traditional religious institutions, nor did society substantially change its pagan nature under his rule. Christians of the 4th century believed Constantine's conversion was evidence the Christian God had conquered the pagan gods in heaven. 4th century Christians writing after 312 constructed this as a universal narrative, describing the mighty conflict as begun with the resurrection of Jesus and victoriously completed in Constantine. Brown says Constantine's conversion meant that, as far as paganism was concerned, everything was done but the sweeping up. In most areas, polytheists were not molested, and apart from a few ugly incidents of local violence, Jewish communities also enjoyed a century of stable, even privileged existence. 4th century Christians focused on heresy as the higher priority. Constantine's policies were largely continued by his sons, though not universally or continuously. By the middle of the 4th century, it is likely that Christians comprised somewhere around half of the empire's population. Christian monasticism grew from roots in certain strands of Judaism and views in common with Greco-Roman philosophy and religion, and was modeled upon scriptural examples and ideals such as John the Baptist, who was seen as an archetypical monk. Christian monasticism emerged separately from these other previous forms in the 3rd century. By the 330s, it had become a significant social and religious force. By the 5th century, Christian monasticism was a dominant force in all areas of late antique culture. Monastic communities were, in general, devoted to prayer, moderate self-denial, manual labor, and mutual support. However, early monastics also developed a healthcare system which allowed the sick to remain within the monastery as a special class, afforded special benefits and care. This destigmatized illness and formed the basis for future public health care. Central figures in the development of monasticism were Basil the Great in the East, and in the West, Benedict, who created the rule of Saint Benedict, which would become the most common rule throughout the Middle Ages, and the starting point for other monastic rules. During antiquity, the Eastern Church produced multiple doctrinal controversies that attempted to define how and when Christ became both human and divine. These were often dubbed heresies by their opponents, and during this age, the first ecumenical councils were convened to deal with them. The first, and most influential, was between Arianism and Orthodox Trinitarianism. Arianism argued that the Christ was divine, but was a creation, and was therefore not equal to the Father. This spread throughout most of the Roman Empire from the 4th century onwards. The First Council of Nicaea, 325, and the First Council of Constantinople, 381, resulted in a condemnation of Arian teachings as heresy and produced the Nicene Creed. Arianism was eventually eliminated by Orthodox opposition and empirical law, though it remained popular for some time. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th ecumenical councils are generally considered the most important of the remaining councils, and all are characterized by Nestorianism, viz. Monophysitism. The West came down firmly on the side of stressing the humanity of Christ and the reality of his moral choices. To preserve his divine nature, the unity of his person was described in a looser way than in Eastern theology. It was primarily this difference which was at the heart of the Nestorian controversy. The resulting schism created a communion of churches, including the Armenian, Syrian, and Egyptian churches. By the end of the 5th century, the Persian Church had become independent of the Roman Church, eventually evolving into the modern Church of the East. Though efforts were made at reconciliation in the next few centuries, the schism remained permanent, resulting in what is today known as Oriental Orthodoxy. Most Christians in Asia belonged to branches of the Nestorian Church from the end of the 5th century into the 13th century. In the 4th century, Augustine argued that the Jewish people should not be forcibly converted or killed, but that they should be left alone. Until the 13th century, that left the Jews in an odd position in society as both protected and condemned by Christian teaching. According to Anna Sapir Abiolafia, most scholars agree that Jews and Christians in Latin Christendom lived in relative peace with one another until the 13th century. CSE. 3. Scattered violence toward Jews occasionally took place during riots led by mobs, local leaders, and lower-level clergy, without the support of church leaders who generally followed Augustine's teachings. 81:17. Sometime before the 5th century, the Church took its universally held traditional interpretation of Revelation 24:6, millennialism, and augmented it with supersessionism. Millennialism is the hope of the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah on earth, centered in Jerusalem, ruling with the redeemed Israel. Supersessionism is a historicized and allegorized version of this, which sees the Church as the metaphorical Israel, thereby eliminating the Jews altogether. Exi 12 supersessionism is significant because it is undeniable that anti-Jewish bias has often gone hand in with the supersessionist view. 5-6 many Jewish writers trace anti-Semitism and the consequences of it in World War II to this particular doctrine among Christians. 9. Supersessionism has been a part of Christian thought for much of Christian history. 25. However, it has never been an official doctrine and has never been universally held. In the centuries following his death, Theodosius I, 347-395, gained a reputation as the emperor who established Nicene Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Modern historians see this as a later interpretation created by Christian writers for their own purposes. Although Theodosius wrote multiple laws against heresy and sacrifice from the beginning of his reign till its end, sources do not support the view that Theodosius created an environment of intolerance and persecution of pagans. Historian Peter Brown has written that it is impossible to speak of a Christian empire as existing before Justinian I in the 6th century. The first countries to make Christianity their state religion were Armenia, 301, Georgia 4th century, Ethiopia and Eritrea in the 325. Informal primacy was exercised by the Archdiocese of Carthage, a metropolitan archdiocese also known as Church of Carthage. The Church of Carthage thus was to the early African Church what the Church of Rome was to the Catholic Church in Italy. Famous figures include Saint Perpetua, Saint Felicitas, and their companions died c. 203, Tertullian 255, 240, Cyprian 240, Cyprian 258, Caecilianus Floruit 311, Saint Aurelius died 429, Augustine of Hippo died 429. Augustine of Hippo died. In reaction to the reinstatement of bishops who had fled during the persecution of Diocletian, Donatism formed as a Christian sect and withdrew from Catholicism. It mainly flourished among the indigenous North African Berber population during the 4th and 5th centuries. 254 by the time Augustine became coadjutor bishop of Hippo in 395. Donatists had been fomenting protests and street violence, refusing compromise, and attacking random Catholics without warning for decades. They often did serious and unprovoked bodily harm, such as beating people with clubs, cutting off hands and feet, and gouging out eyes. 173-222 Augustine began defending violence by the imperial authorities as a means of coercing the Donatists to repent, though he always opposed execution. 254 His authority on coercion was undisputed for over a millennium in Western Christianity, and according to Brown, it provided the theological foundation for the justification of medieval persecution. 116. The integration of barbarian people into the Roman world of the 4th century transformed both Roman culture and the barbarians. One aspect of this change was religious. Beginning with the Goths around 369, various Germanic people adopted Christianity and began to form into the distinct ethnic groups that would become the future nations of Europe. Vandals converted shortly before they left Spain for northern Africa in 429. Clovis I converted to Catholicism sometime around 498, founding what would eventually become the Carolingian dynasty. In all cases, Christianization meant the Germanic conquerors lost their native languages as these languages became Latinized. At least one historian of the time, Orosius, wrote that conversion made the barbarians milder and set limits on their savagery. Historian Geoffrey Blainey writes that the Catholic Church in the period between the fall of Rome, 476 CE, and the rise of the Carolingian Franks, 150 CE, was like an early version of a welfare state. It conducted hospitals for the old and orphanages for the young, hospices for the sick of all ages, places for the lepers, and hostels or inns where pilgrims could buy a cheap bed and meal. It supplied food to the population during famine and distributed food to the poor. Monasteries preserved classical craft and artistic skills while maintaining intellectual culture within their schools, scriptoria, and libraries. As well as providing a focus for spiritual life, they functioned as agricultural, economic, and production centers, particularly in remote regions. These early monasteries were models of productivity and economic resourcefulness, teaching their local communities animal husbandry, cheese-making, wine-making, and various other skills. Medical practice was highly important, and medieval monasteries are best known for their contributions to medical tradition. They also made advances in sciences such as astronomy, and St. Benedict's Rule, 485-143, impacted politics and law. Intro. The formation of these organized bodies of believers, distinct from political and familial authority, especially for women, gradually carved out a series of social spaces with some amount of independence, thereby revolutionizing social history. After the fall of Rome in the late 5th century, the Church gradually replaced the Roman Empire as the unifying force in Europe, providing what security there was, actively preserving ancient texts and literacy. Pope Celestine I, 430, sent Palladius to be the first bishop to the Irish in 431, and in 432, Gaul supported Patrick as he began his mission there. Relying largely on recent archaeological developments, Lorcan Harney has reported to the Royal Academy that the missionaries and traders who came to Ireland in the 5th to 6th centuries were not backed by any military force. Recent archaeology indicates Christianity had become an established minority faith in some parts of Britain by the 4th century. It was largely mainstream and in certain areas was continuous. Irish missionaries led by St. Columba went to Iona from 563 and converted many Picts. The court of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria and the Gregorian mission, who landed in 596, sent by Pope Gregory I and led by Augustine of Canterbury, did the same for the Kingdom of Kent. The Franks first appear in the historical record in the 3rd century as a confederation of Germanic tribes living on the 3rd century as a confederation of Germanic tribes living on the east bank of the lower Rhine River. The largely Christian Gallo-Roman inhabitants of Gaul, modern France and Belgium, were overrun by the Franks in the early 5th century. They were persecuted until the Frankish king Clovis I converted from paganism to Roman Catholicism in 496. Clovis I became the first king of the Franks to unite all of the Frankish tribes under one ruler. In 416, the Germanic Visigoths had crossed into Hispania as Roman allies. They converted to Arian Christianity shortly before 429. An important shift took place in 612 when the Visigothic king Sesbu declared the obligatory conversion of all Jews in Spain, contradicting Pope Gregory, who had reiterated the traditional ban against forced conversion of the Jews in 591. Scholars refer to this shift as a seismic moment in Christian history. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its heartland in Greece and Asia Minor, became the Byzantine Empire after the fall of the Roman West. With its autocratic government, stable farm economy, Greek heritage, and Orthodox Christianity, the Byzantine Empire lasted until 1453 and the fall of Constantinople. During Byzantium's first major historical period, from 476 to 641, its borders reached its furthest limits under the Emperor Justinian I. In an attempt to reunite the empire, Justinian went to Rome to liberate it from barbarians, leading to a guerrilla war that lasted nearly 20 years. After fighting ended, Justinian used a pragmatic sanction to assert control over Italy. The sanction effectively removed the supports that had allowed the Roman Senate to retain power. Thereafter, the political and social influence of the Senate's aristocratic members disappeared, and by 630, the Senate ceased to exist. Its building was converted into a church. Bishops stepped into civic leadership in the senators' places. The position and influence of the Pope rose. Before the 8th century, the Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, had not had special influence over other bishops outside Rome and had not yet manifested as the central ecclesiastical power. From the late 7th to the middle of the 8th century, 11 of the 13 men who held the position of Roman Pope were the sons of families from the East. Before they could be installed, these popes had to be approved by the head of state, the Byzantine emperor. This Byzantine papacy, along with losses to Islam and changes within Christianity itself, helped put an end to ancient Christianity in the West. This helped transform Christianity into its eclectic medieval forms. In terms of prosperity and cultural life, the Byzantine Empire of this period forms one of the high points of Christian history and Christian civilization, and Constantinople remained the leading city of the Christian world in size, wealth, and culture. There was a renewed interest in classical Greek philosophy and science, as well as an increase in literary output in vernacular Greek. Byzantine art and literature held a preeminent place in Europe, and the cultural impact of Byzantine art on the West during this period was enormous and of long-lasting significance. Following a series of heavy military reversals against the Muslims, iconoclasm emerged within the provinces of the Byzantine Empire in the early 8th century. In the 720s, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, banned the pictorial representation of Christ, saints, and biblical scenes. In the Latin West, Pope Gregory III held 2 synods at Rome and condemned Leo's actions. The Byzantine Iconoclast Council, held at Hieria in 754 AD, ruled that holy portraits were heretical. The iconoclastic movement destroyed much of the Christian Church's early artistic history. The iconoclastic movement was later defined as heretical in 787 AD. Under the Second Council of Nicaea, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, but had a brief resurgence between 815 and 842 AD. The rise of Islam from 600 to 1517 unleashed a series of military campaigns that conquered Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Persia by 650, adding North Africa and most of Spain by 740. Only the Franks in Constantinople were able to withstand this medieval juggernaut. Islam was the colossus of the Middle Ages. Historians Matthews and Platt wrote that, at its height, the Arab Empire stretched from the Indus River and the borders of China in the east to the Atlantic in the west, and from the Taurus Mountains in the north to the Sahara in the south. Since they are considered people of the book in the Islamic religion, Christians under Muslim rule were subjected to the status of dhimmi, which was inferior to the status of Muslims. Thus, Christians and other religious minorities faced religious discrimination and persecution. Various Christian communities in the regions of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Armenia resented the governance of the Western Roman Empire or that of the Byzantine Empire and preferred to live as dhimmi under the Muslim rulers. However, modern historians also recognize that the Christian populations living in the lands invaded by the Arab Muslim armies between the 7th and 10th centuries AD suffered religious persecution, religious violence, forced conversion to Islam, and martyrdom multiple times at the hands of Arab Muslim officials and rulers. Many were executed under the Islamic death penalty for defending their Christian faith. In general, Christians subject to Islamic rule were allowed to practice their religion with some notable limitations stemming from the apocryphal Pact of Umar. This treaty, supposedly enacted in 717 AD, forbade Christians from publicly displaying the cross on church buildings, from summoning congregants to prayer with a bell, from rebuilding or repairing churches and monasteries after they had been destroyed or damaged, and imposed other restrictions relating to occupations, clothing, and weapons. The Umayyad Caliphate persecuted many Berber Christians in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, who slowly converted to Islam. The Abbasid Caliphate was less tolerant of Christianity than had been the Umayyad Caliphs. Those such as Elias of Heliopolis, monks and prisoners of war who refused to convert were frequently killed. 41, 42, 70 nonetheless. Christian officials continued to be employed in the government, and the Christians of the Church of the East and the Jacobite Church were often tasked with the translation of ancient Greek philosophy and Greek mathematics. The intense and rapid changes of the High Middle Ages are considered some of the most significant in the history of Christianity. Saxon resistance to rule by the Carolingian kings was fierce and often targeted Christian churches and monasteries. In 782, Saxons broke yet another treaty with Charlemagne, attacking the Franks when the king was away, dealing the Frankish troops heavy losses. In response, the Frankish king returned, defeated them, and enacted a variety of draconian measures beginning with the massacre at Verdun. He ordered the decapitation of 4,500 Saxon prisoners, offering them baptism as an alternative to death. These events were followed by the severe legislation of the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae in 785, which prescribes death to those that are disloyal to the king, harm Christian churches or its ministers, or practice pagan burial rites. His harsh methods raised objections from his friends Alcuin and Paulinus of Aquileia. Charlemagne abolished the death penalty for paganism in 797. Charlemagne also began the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intellectual and cultural revival of literature, arts, and scriptural studies, a renovation of law in the courts, and the promotion of literacy. Charlemagne himself could not read or write, but he admired it, so in order to address the problems of illiteracy, Charlemagne founded schools and attracted the most learned men from all of Europe to his court. They had many accomplishments, including the development of lowercase letters called Carolingian minuscule. Beginning in the late 8th century under Charlemagne, Renaissance continued into the 9th century. Under his son Louis the Pious, Charlemagne transformed law and founded feudalism. The church of this era had immense authority, but the key to its power were three monastic Reformation movements that swept Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries. Prior to this, the church had become riddled with corruption, the buying and selling of church offices, and disregard for the sacraments, owing to its stricter adherence to the Reformed Benedictine rule. The Abbey of Cluny became the leading center of Western monasticism from the later 10th century. The monastery at Cluny was established in 910 by the Benedictine order without feudal obligations, allowing it to institute reforms. The Cluniac spirit was a revitalizing influence on the Norman Church, at its height from the second half of the 10th century through the early 12th century. The next wave of monastic reform came with the Cistercian movement. The first Cistercian abbey was founded in 1098 at Citeaux Abbey. The keynote of Cistercian life was a return to a literal observance of the Benedictine rule, rejecting the developments of the Benedictines. Inspired by Bernard of Clairvaux, the primary builder of the Cistercians, they became the main force of technological advancement and diffusion in medieval Europe. A third level of monastic reform was provided by the establishment of the mendicant orders. Beginning in the 12th century, the Franciscan order was instituted by the followers of Francis of Assisi, and thereafter the Dominican order was begun by Saint Dominic. Ancient Christians had not thought of their movement in terms of social reform, whereas a profound revolution in religious sentiment led the new monastics to see their calling as actively working to reform the world. Commonly known as friars, mendicants live under a monastic rule with traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they emphasize preaching, missionary activity, and education. The monks' new focus on reforming the world influenced the next 400 years of European history. Dominicans came to dominate the new universities. They traveled about preaching against heresy and eventually became notorious for their participation in the medieval Inquisition, the Albigensian Crusade, and the Northern Crusades. Christian policy denying the existence of witches and witchcraft would later be challenged by the Dominicans, allowing them to participate in witch trials. While the Middle Ages was a difficult time for most women, abbesses and female superiors of monastic houses were powerful figures whose influence could rival that of male bishops and abbots. The Gregorian reform also impacted women in general by establishing new law requiring the consent of both parties before a marriage could be performed, a minimum age for marriage, and by codifying marriage as a sacrament. 23 that made the union a binding contract, making abandonment prosecutable with dissolution of marriage overseen by church authorities. 36 although the church abandoned tradition to allow women the same rights as men to dissolve a marriage. In practice, men were granted dissolutions more frequently than women. Throughout Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Romania, Serbia, and Slovenia, and the area north of the Danube, Poland, Hungary, Russia, Christianization and political centralization went hand in hand. Local elites wanted to convert because they gained prestige and power through matrimonial alliances and participation in imperial rituals. Significant missionary activity in this region only took place after Charlemagne defeated the Avar Kaganates several times at the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th century and the beginning of the 9th centuries. Two Byzantine brothers, Saints Constantine, Kirill, and Methodius, played the key missionary roles in spreading Christianity to Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia territories beginning in 863. They spent approximately 40 months in Great Moravia continuously translating texts, teaching students, and developing the first Slavic alphabet while translating the Gospel into the Old Church Slavonic language. Old Church Slavonic became the first literary language of the Slavs and eventually the educational foundation for all Slavic nations. Many differences between East and West had existed since antiquity. Disagreements over whether Pope or Patriarch should lead the Church, whether that should be done in Latin or Greek, whether priests must remain celibate, and other points of doctrine such as the Filioque clause, which was added to the Nicene Creed by the West, were intensified by cultural, geographical, geopolitical, and linguistic differences between East and West. Eventually, this produced the East-West Schism, also known as the Great Schism of 1054, which separated the Church into Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Modern Western universities have their origins directly in the medieval Church. They began as cathedral schools, and all students were considered clerics. This was a benefit as it placed the students under ecclesiastical jurisdiction and thus imparted certain legal immunities and protections. The cathedral schools eventually became partially detached from the cathedrals and formed their own institutions, the earliest being the University of Bologna, 1088, the University of Oxford, 1096, and the University of Paris, 1150. The investiture controversy was the most significant conflict between secular and religious powers that took place in medieval Europe. It began as a dispute in the 11th century between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII concerning who would appoint bishops' investiture. Ending lay investiture threatened to undercut the power of the Holy Roman Empire and the ambitions of the European nobility. But allowing lay investiture meant the Pope's authority over his own people was limited. A similar controversy occurred in England between King Henry I and St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, over investiture and episcopal vacancy. The English dispute was resolved by the Concordat of London, 1107. Generally, the Crusades, 1095-1291, refer to the European Christian campaigns in the Holy Land sponsored by the papacy against Muslims in order to reconquer the region of Palestine. There were other Crusader expeditions against the Islamic forces in the Mediterranean, primarily in southern Spain, southern Italy, and the islands of Cyprus, Malta, and Sicily. The papacy also sponsored crusades against the pagan peoples of northeastern Europe called the Baltic Wars, and against any who were seen as enemies of the faith. The Holy Land had been part of the Roman Empire, and thus subsequently of the Byzantine Empire until the Arab-Muslim invasions of the 7th and 8th centuries. Thereafter, Christians had generally been permitted to visit the sacred places in the Holy Land until 1070. When the Seljuk Turks closed Christian pilgrimages and assailed the Byzantines, defeating them at the Battle of Massacre. Emperor Alexius I asked for aid from Pope Urban II against Islamic aggression. He probably expected money from the Pope for the hiring of mercenaries. Instead, Urban II called upon the Knights of Christendom in a speech made at the Council of Clermont on 27 November 1095, combining the idea of pilgrimage to the Holy Land with that of defending the defenseless by waging a holy war against infidels. The First Crusade captured Antioch in 1099, and then Jerusalem. The Second Crusade occurred in 1145 when Edessa was taken by Islamic forces. Jerusalem was held until 1187 and the Third Crusade, after battles between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. The Fourth Crusade, begun by Innocent III in 1202, intended to retake the Holy Land but was soon subverted by the Venetians. When the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople, they sacked the city and other parts of Asia Minor and established the Latin Empire of Constantinople in Greece and Asia Minor. 5 numbered crusades to the Holy Land culminated in the Siege of Acre of 1219, essentially ending the Western presence in the Holy Land. Jerusalem was held by the Crusaders for nearly a century, while other strongholds in the Near East remained in Christian possession much longer. The Crusades in the Holy Land ultimately failed to establish permanent Christian kingdoms. Islamic expansion into Europe remained a threat for centuries, culminating in the campaigns of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. When the Pope, blessed Eugenius III, 1145-1153, called for a second crusade in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144, Saxon nobles in Eastern Europe refused to go. From the days of Charlemagne, 747-814, the free barbarian people around the Baltic Sea had raided the countries that surrounded them, stealing crucial resources, killing, and enslaving captives. For the leaders of these countries, that meant subduing the Baltic area was more important to them than going to the Levant. In 1147, Eugenius' Divinis Divini Dispensatione gave the Eastern nobles crusade indulgences for the Baltic area. The Northern, or Baltic, crusades followed, taking place off and on with and without papal support from 1147 to 1316. These rulers saw holy war as a tool for territorial expansion, alliance building, and the empowerment of their own young church and state. Taking the time for peaceful conversion did not fit in with these plans. Conversion by these princes was almost always a result of conquest, either by the direct use of force or indirectly, when a leader converted and required it of his followers, according to Faunusberg Schmidt. While the theologians maintained that conversion should be voluntary, there was a widespread pragmatic acceptance of conversion obtained through political pressure or military coercion. There were often severe consequences for populations that chose to resist. The medieval Inquisition, including the Episcopal Inquisition, 1184-1230, and the later Papal Inquisition, 1230s, 1240s, was a type of criminal court established and run by the Roman Catholic Church from around 1184. Inquisition placed an overseeing authority into the position of the wronged party, who made the accusation against the suspect. Then that same authority did the investigating and also judged their guilt. Dependent upon undependable secular support, inquisitions dealt largely, but not exclusively, with religious issues such as heresy. Inquisition was not a unified, single bureaucratic institution. Jurisdiction was often local and limited. Lack of support and outright opposition often obstructed it. And many parts of Europe had erratic inquisitions or none at all. Historian Christine Caldwell Ames writes that Dominican inquisitors saw their work as proving the true faith, by interpreting Christ as the just persecutor of evil. Ames calls this a measured manipulation of the Christian faith. Supported by circumstance, since heresy had exploded across Christendom in the 11th century, at the same time, Inquisition was contested stridently through continuous and various kinds of opposition and complaint, both in and outside the Church. Opponents charged heresy inquisitions with proving the Roman Church was unchristian and a destroyer of its gospel legacy, or even the real enemy of Christ. Canon law of the Catholic Church, Latin. Jus canonicum was the first modern Western legal system and is the oldest continuously functioning legal system in the West, predating European common law and civil law tradition. Justinian's reforms had a clear effect on the evolution of jurisprudence, and Leo III's Ecloga influenced the formation of legal institutions in the Slavic world. By the 1300s, most bishops and popes were trained lawyers rather than theologians. By 1150, Western culture became more secular as kings actively worked to centralize power into themselves and their nations. This was accomplished by taking legal, military, and social powers away from local-level aristocrats and local church leaders who had traditionally held such powers. The state attacked the older kinship systems by redefining membership in a minority as being a threat to the social order, proactively pursuing punishment through stereotyping, propaganda, and the legal prosecution of minorities, functioned socially and politically to legitimate the state and its authority and enable the transfer of power. By 1200, local authority had been replaced by inquisition that was dependent upon state support. Moore writes that persecution became a functional tool of power and a core element in the social and political development of Western society. The Church did not have the leading role in this, but had a part in it. Conditional toleration that included discrimination became status quo everywhere in Europe. By the 1300s, the maintenance of civil order through legislated separation and discrimination was part of the institutional structure of all European states, ingrained in law, politics, and the economy, and at least somewhat within canon law and religion as well. 8. The popes of the 14th century worked to amass power into the papal position, building what is often called the papal monarchy. This was accomplished partly through the reorganization of the ecclesiastical financial system. The poor had previously been allowed to offer their tithes and goods and services, but these popes revamped the system to only accept money. A steady cash flow brought with it the power of great wealth. The papal states were thereafter governed by the pope in the same manner the secular powers governed. The pope became a pseudo-monarch. These 14th century popes were greedy and politically corrupt, so that pious Christians of the period became disgusted, leading to the loss of papal prestige. Devoted and virtuous nuns and monks became increasingly rare. Monastic reform had been a major force in the High Middle Ages, but it is largely unknown in the Late Middle Ages. People living during the 14th century experienced plague, famine, and war that ravaged most of the continent. There was social unrest, urban riots, peasant revolts, and renegade feudal armies, and this was in addition to the religious changes often forced upon them by their new monarchies. They faced all of this with a church unable to provide much moral leadership as a result of its own internal conflict and corruption. The church reached its low point in the early 1400s when there were 3 different men claiming to be the rightful pope. In 1309, Pope Clement V moved to Avignon in southern France in search of relief from Rome's factional politics. 7 popes resided there in the Avignon papacy until 1378. Troubles grew while the prestige and influence of Rome decreased without a resident pontiff, and in 1377 Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome. After his death, the papal conclave met in 1378 in Rome and elected an Italian Urban VI to succeed Gregory. The French cardinals did not approve. They held a second conclave, electing Robert of Geneva instead. This began the Western Schism, establishing two popes, two colleges of cardinals, two curios, and two church tax systems, both existing at the same time. Different secular leaders threw their support behind one or the other. Papal authority declined. In 1409, both sets of cardinals called the Pisan Council, electing a third pope and calling on the other two to resign, but they refused, leaving the church with three popes. The Council of Constance, 1414-1418, called by the Holy Roman Emperor, finally resolved the conflict by electing Pope Martin V to replace the rest. In 1418, the papacy regained control of the church, consolidated the papal states, and focused on the pursuit of power. During this time, wealthy Italian families secured episcopal offices for themselves. The individuals who became Pope Alexander VI and Pope Sixtus IV were known for ignoring the moral requirements of their position. Pontiffs such as Julius II often waged campaigns to protect and expand their domains, and popes spent lavishly on both private luxuries and public works. John Wycliffe, an English scholastic, philosopher, and Christian theologian best known for denouncing the abuses and corruption of the Catholic Church, was a precursor of the Protestant Reformation. He emphasized the supremacy of the Bible and called for a direct relationship between God and the human person without interference by priests and bishops. The Lollards, a proto-Protestant Christian movement that followed the teachings of Wycliffe, played a role in the English Reformation. John Huss, a Czech Christian theologian based in Prague, was influenced by Wycliffe and spoke out against the abuses and corruption he saw in the Catholic Church. His followers became known as the Hussites, a proto-Protestant Christian movement that followed the teachings of Jan Hus, who became the best-known representative of the Bohemian Reformation. He was a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation, and his legacy has become a powerful symbol of Sikh culture in Bohemia. Both Wycliffe and Hus were accused of heresy and subsequently condemned to the death penalty for their outspoken views about the Catholic Church. High Renaissance was the most brilliantly creative period of Western history, and it was the popes who became the leading patrons of the new style, and the Church which commissioned and supported such artists as Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, Bramante, Raphael, Fra Angelico, Donatello, Oronatello, Brinadello, and Leonardo da Vinci. Scholars of the Renaissance created textual criticism, which revealed writing errors by medieval monks and exposed the donation of Constantine as a forgery. Popes of the Middle Ages had depended upon the document to prove their political authority. Catholic monks developed the first forms of modern Western musical notation, leading to the development of classical music and all its derivatives. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. The flight of Eastern Christians from Constantinople, and the Greek manuscripts they carried with them, is one of the factors that prompted the literary Renaissance in the West. The Ottoman government followed Islamic law when dealing with the conquered Christian population. The Church's canonical and hierarchical organization were not significantly disrupted, and its administration continued to function. However, these rights and privileges, including freedom of worship and religious organization, were often established in principle but seldom corresponded to reality. The Hagia Sophia and the Parthenon, which had been Christian churches for nearly a millennium, were converted into mosques. Violent persecutions of Christians were common and reached their climax in the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides. Cathars, also known as Albigensians, were the largest of the heretic groups that began reappearing in the High Middle Ages. In 1209, after decades of having called upon secular rulers for aid in dealing with the Cathars and getting no response, 48 Pope Innocent III and the King of France Philip Augustus joined in a military campaign against them. 47 scholars disagree on whether war was determined more by the Pope or by King Philip and his proxies. On 22 July 1209, in the First Battle of the Albigensian Crusade, mercenaries rampaged through the streets, killing all they came across in what came to be known as the Massacre of Béziers. Some 20 years later, a story that historian Lawrence Marvin calls apocryphal arose about this event, claiming the papal legate, Arnaud Amaury, was said to have responded, "Kill them all, let God sort them out." Marvin says it is unlikely the legate ever said anything at all. The speed and spontaneity of the attack indicates that the legate probably did not know what was going on until it was over. 44 other scholars argue that the statement is not inconsistent with what was recorded by the contemporaries of other church leaders, or with what is known of Arnaud Amaury's character and attitudes. 4 years later, in a 1213 letter to Amaury, the Pope rebuked the legate for his conduct in the war and called for an end to the campaign. The campaign continued anyway. The Pope was then reversed by the Fourth Lateran Council, which reinstituted crusade status 2 years later in 1215. Afterwards, the Pope removed it yet again. Innocent vacillated. Unable to make up his mind if crusade had been right, he went back and forth, taking the side favoring crusade, then siding against it. 235-236, there was no longer any crusade, nor dispensational rewards for fighting it by the end of the campaign 16 years later. The army occupied lands of nobles who had not sponsored Cathars but had been in the good graces of the church. Albigensia became southern France, and Catharism itself continued for another 100 years until 1350. Between 711 and 718, the Iberian Peninsula had been conquered by Muslims in the Umayyad conquest. The military struggle to reclaim the peninsula from Muslim rule had been taking place for centuries until the Christian kingdoms reconquered the Moorish states of Al-Andalus in 1492. Isabel and Ferdinand united Spain with themselves as the first king and queen, fought the Muslims in the Reconquista, and established the Spanish Inquisition. During this time, New Christians had begun to appear as a socio-religious designation and legal distinction in the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire. Most of the history of the New Christians refers to the Jewish converts, who were generally known as conversos or marinos, while the Muslim converts were known as moriscos. The Spanish Inquisition was originally authorized by the Pope in answer to royal fears that conversos and marinos were spying and attempting to sabotage the new state. The initial inquisitors proved so severe that the Pope soon opposed it and unsuccessfully attempted to shut it down. Ferdinand is said to have pressured the Pope, and in October 1483, a papal bull conceded control of the Inquisition to the Spanish crown. According to Spanish historian José Casanova, the Spanish Inquisition became the first truly national, unified, and centralized state institution. It functioned as Ferdinand and Isabella's personal police force, existing separately and above even the nobles of the state. Between 1150 and 1200, Christian scholars had traveled to Sicily and Spain to retrieve the writings of Aristotle, which had been lost to the West after the fall of the Roman Empire. This produced a period of cultural ferment that one modern historian has called the 12th century Renaissance. Thomas Aquinas responded by writing his monumental summas in support of human reason as compatible with faith. Christian theology adapted to Aristotle's secular and humanistic natural philosophy. By the late Middle Ages, Aquinas' rationalism was being heatedly debated in the new universities. William Ockham resolved the conflict by arguing that faith and reason should be pursued separately so that each could achieve its own end. Historians of science David C. Lindbergh, Ronald Numbers, and Edward Grant have described what followed as a medieval scientific revival. Science historian Noah Ephron has written that Christianity provided the early tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Following the geographic discoveries of the 1400s and 1500s, increasing population and inflation led the emerging nation states of Portugal, Spain, and France, the Dutch Republic, and England to explore, conquer, colonize, and exploit the newly discovered territories. While colonialism was primarily economic and political, it also opened the door for Christian missions. Some missionaries supported colonialism and an almost equal number opposed it. According to historical theologian Justo Gonzalez, colonialism and missions each sometimes aided and sometimes impeded the other. Different state actors created colonies that varied widely. Some colonies had institutions that allowed native populations to reap some benefits. Others became extractive colonies with predatory rule that produced an autocracy with a dismal record. For 200 years, European society had legislated discrimination as part of its institutional structure. 8. Therefore, beginning with the first wave of European colonization, many colonies also practiced religious discrimination, along with racialism and political discrimination, persecution, and violence toward the people and their native religions. Portugal practiced extractive colonialism, and the Spanish military was known for its ill treatment of Amerindians. Spanish missionaries are generally credited with championing efforts to initiate protective laws for the Indians and for working against their enslavement. Historian Jacob Schachter says ambivalent benevolence was at the heart of most British and American attitudes toward natives. A catastrophe was wrought upon the Amerindians by contact with Europeans. Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, malaria, and many others spread through Indian populations. In most of the New World, 90% or more of the native population was destroyed by wave after wave of previously unknown afflictions. Explorers and colonists did not enter an empty land, but rather an emptied one. Having continued as a demi-community under the Sunni Caliphate after the Muslim conquest of Persia, 633-654, the Church of the East played a major role in the history of Christianity in Asia. Between the 9th and 14th centuries, it represented the world's largest Christian denomination in terms of geographical extent. It established dioceses and communities stretching from the Mediterranean Sea in today's Iraq and Iran to India, the St. Thomas-Syrian Christians of Kerala, the Mongol kingdoms in Central Asia, the Turkic tribes in Central Asia, the Turkic tribes in Central Asia, and China during the Tang Dynasty 7th, 9th centuries. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Church experienced a final period of expansion under the Mongol Empire, where influential Church of the East clergy sat in the Mongol court. In the early 16th century, attempts were made by the Christian theologians Martin Luther and Huldrych Zwingli, along with many others, to reform the Catholic Church. They considered the roots of corruption within the Catholic Church and its ecclesiastical structure to be doctrinal rather than simply a matter of depravity, moral weakness, or lack of ecclesiastical discipline, and thus advocated for God's autonomy and redemption, and against voluntaristic notions that salvation could be earned by people. The Reformation is usually considered to have started with the publication of the 95 Theses by Luther in 1517, although there was no schism until the 1520 Diet of Worms. The edicts of the Diet condemned Luther and officially banned citizens of the Holy Roman Empire from defending or propagating his ideas. The word Protestant is derived from the Latin protestation, meaning declaration, which refers to the letter of protestation by Lutheran princes against the decision of the Diet of Speyer in 1529, which reaffirmed the edict of the Diet of Worms ordering the seizure of all property owned by persons guilty of advocating Lutheranism. The term Protestant was not originally used by Reformation-era leaders. Instead, they called themselves evangelical, emphasizing the return to the true gospel, Greek, euangelion. Early protest was against corruption such as simony, the buying and selling of church offices, the holding of multiple church offices by one person at the same time, episcopal vacancies, and the sale of indulgences. The Protestant position also included the five soli, sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, solus Christus, soli Deo gloria, the priesthood of all believers, law and gospel, and the two kingdoms doctrine. The three most important traditions to emerge directly from the Reformation were the Lutheran, Reformed, and Anglican traditions, though the latter group identifies as both Reformed and Catholic, and some subgroups reject the classification as Protestant. Unlike other reform movements, the English Reformation began by royal influence. Henry VIII considered himself a thoroughly Catholic king, and in 1521 he defended the papacy against Luther in a book he commissioned entitled The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, for which Pope Leo X awarded him the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. However, the king came into conflict with the papacy when he wished to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, for which he needed papal sanction. Catherine, Among many other noble relations was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the papacy's most significant secular supporter. The ensuing dispute eventually led to a break from Rome and the declaration of the King of England as head of the English Church, which saw itself as a Protestant church navigating a middle way between Lutheranism and Reformed Christianity, but leaning more towards the latter. Consequently, England experienced periods of reform and also Counter-Reformation. Monarchs such as Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and archbishops of Canterbury such as Thomas Cranmer and William Laud pushed the Church of England in different directions over the course of only a few generations. What emerged was the Elizabethan religious settlement and a state church that considered itself both Reformed and Catholic, but not Roman, and other unofficial more radical movements, such as the Puritans. In terms of politics, the English Reformation included heresy trials, the exiling of Roman Catholic populations to Spain and other Roman Catholic lands, and censorship and prohibition of books. Protestantism has promoted economic growth and entrepreneurship, especially in the period after the scientific and the Industrial Revolution. Scholars have identified a positive correlation between the rise of Protestantism and human capital formation, work ethic, economic development, and the development of the state system. According to the Merton thesis, there was a positive correlation between the rise of English Puritanism and German Pietism on the one hand, and early experimental science on the other. Max Weber, in his book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1904-1905, asserted that Protestant ethics and values, along with the Calvinist doctrine of asceticism and predestination, gave birth to capitalism. Weber says this contributed to economic growth and the development of banking across Northern Europe. As one of the most influential and cited books in sociology, its thesis has been controversial since its release. In opposition to Weber, historians such as Ferdinand Brodel and Hugh Trevor Roper assert that capitalism developed in pre-Reformation Catholic communities. Joseph Schumpeter, an economist of the 20th century, has referred to the scholastics as they who come nearer than does any other group to having been the founders of scientific economics. Beginning in Germany and Switzerland in the 16th century, the Radical Reformation was a disorderly collection of loosely related Reformation groups that included Anabaptists, spiritualists, and evangelical rationalists. They opposed the traditional church-state theories of classical Protestantism. Lutherans, Reformed, and Elizabethans were often indifferent to governmental jurisdiction altogether and supported a full separation from the state. Rejecting Luther's key teachings on salvation by faith alone and predestination, along with Catholic transubstantiation, places them equally distant from classical Protestantism and Tridentine Catholicism according to historian George Hunston Williams. XX XXXXXXXXXXXXXX. The Counter-Reformation was the response of the Catholic Church to the Protestant Reformation. In terms of meetings and documents, it consisted of the Confutatio Augustana, the Council of Trent, the Roman Catechism, and the Defensio Tridentinae Fide. In terms of politics, the Counter-Reformation included heresy trials, the exiling of Protestant populations from Catholic lands, the seizure of children from their Protestant parents for institutionalized Catholic upbringing, a series of wars, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, and the Spanish Inquisition. Although Protestant Christians were excommunicated in an attempt to reduce their influence within the Catholic Church, at the same time they were persecuted during the Counter-Reformation, prompting some to live as crypto-Protestants, also termed Nicodemuts, against the urging of John Calvin, who urged them to live their faith openly. Crypto-Protestants were documented as late as the 19th century in Latin America. The Council of Trent, 1545-1563, initiated by Pope Paul III, addressed issues of certain ecclesiastical corruptions such as simony, absenteeism, nepotism, the holding of multiple church offices by one person, and other abuses. It also reasserted traditional practices and doctrines of the Church, such as the episcopal structure, clerical celibacy, the seven sacraments, transubstantiation, the belief that during Mass the consecrated bread and wine truly become the body and blood of Christ, the veneration of relics, icons and saints, especially the Blessed Virgin Mary, the necessity of both faith and good works for salvation, the existence of purgatory and the issuance, but not the sale of indulgences. In other words, all Protestant doctrinal objections and changes were uncompromisingly rejected. The council also fostered an interest in education for parish priests to increase pastoral care. Milan's Archbishop St. Charles Borromeo set an example by visiting the remotest parishes and instilling high standards. Simultaneous to the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation consisted of improvements in art and culture, anti-corruption measures, the founding of the Jesuits, the establishment of seminaries, a reassertion of traditional doctrines, and the emergence of new religious orders aimed at both moral reform and new missionary activity. Also part of this was the development of new yet orthodox forms of spirituality, such as that of the Spanish mystics and the French school of spirituality. The papacy of St. Pius V was known not only for its focus on halting heresy and worldly abuses within the Church, but also for its focus on improving popular piety in a determined effort to stem the appeal of Protestantism. Pius began his pontificate by giving large alms to the poor, charity, and hospitals, and the pontiff was known for consoling the poor and sick, as well as supporting missionaries. These activities coincided with the rediscovery of the ancient Christian catacombs in Rome. As Dr. Made McCulloch states, just as these ancient martyrs were revealed once more, Catholics were beginning to be martyred afresh, both in mission fields overseas and in the struggle to win back Protestant Northern Europe. The catacombs proved to be an inspiration for many to action and to heroism. Catholic missions were carried to new places beginning with the New Age of Discovery, and the Roman Catholic Church established missions in the Americas. Religious wars were fought in Europe after the Protestant Reformation in the early modern era. They ranged from international wars to internal conflicts. They began in the Holy Roman Empire with the Minor Knights' Revolt, 1522, which called for governmental reform and almost immediately inspired the larger and more serious Peasants' War, 1524-1525. Warfare intensified in the First Schmalkaldic War, 1546-470, and the Second Schmalkaldic War, 1552-1555, after the Catholic Church began the Counter-Reformation. The rise of Calvinism produced a second wave of wars beginning in France in 1562 and the Dutch Revolt of 1562 and the Dutch Revolt of 1567. 7 years after the Peace of Augsburg had established a truce in Germany on the basis of territorialism, France became the center of religious wars which lasted for 36 years. The final wave of religious war led to the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648. Following the erosion of the settlement at Augsburg, the involvement of foreign powers made it the largest and most disastrous. Causes of these wars are debated. Political scientist James Bernard Murphy writes that virtually all major political theorists cite the wars of religions to demonstrate the dangers that religious belief poses to political order. However, scholars have largely interpreted these wars as struggles for independence that coincided with the breakup of medieval empires into the modern nation-states. Many scholars agree the wars of this period were partly fought to obtain security and freedom for each religious confession, but mostly fought for political gain, since national, dynastic, and mercenary interests generally prevailed, although there is as yet no consensus. Until the 1300s, the official position of the Roman Catholic Church was that real witches did not exist. While historians have been unable to pinpoint a single cause of what became known as the witch frenzy, scholars have noted that, without changing church doctrine, a new but common stream of thought developed that witches were both real and malevolent. Wolfgang Behinger ties it to climate change caused by the Little Ice Age, which began around 1300 and lasted into 1850 CE. Scapegoating is observed by 1560. The highest concentration of witch trials occurred in southwestern Germany during the years 1561 to 1670, long after the Protestant Reformation. The majority of those brought to trial were not executed, and most of those accused were never brought to trial. Oncarlu and Clark indicate the main pressure to prosecute witches came from the common people, and trials were mostly civil trials. Most 21st century scholars argue that types of legal systems mattered most in determining a trial's outcome. 4 estimates of the number of people executed have been reduced from early 19th century estimates to a total of approximately 40,000 people, not all of them women. The church had remained divided over the existence of witches and methods for dealing with the accused. Inquisitions did not generally convict or execute them. In 1631, using sarcasm, ridicule, and piercing logic, the Jesuit Friedrich Spee wrote Cautio Criminalis, Precautions for Prosecutors, in which he sought to expose the flawed arguments and methods used by the Dominican witch hunters. 33. The moral impression of his book was great. Witch trials became scant in the second half of the 17th century and eventually simply subsided. 10. VI XXV. History of the Inquisition divides into 2 major parts: its papal creation in the early 13th century and its transformation into permanent secular governmental bureaucracies between 1478 and 1542. Historian Helen Rawling says the Spanish Inquisition was different from earlier Inquisitions in one fundamental respect. It was responsible to the crown rather than the Pope and was used to consolidate state interest. The Portuguese Inquisition, in close relationship with the Church, was also controlled by the Crown, who established a government board, known as the General Council, to oversee it. The Grand Inquisitor, chosen by the king, was nearly always a member of the royal family. T.F. Meyer, historian, writes that the Roman Inquisition operated to serve the papacy's long-standing political aims in Naples, Venice, and Florence. Its activity was primarily bureaucratic. The Roman Inquisition is probably best known for its condemnation of Galileo. 5. In 1610, Galileo published his Sidereus Nuncius, Starry Messenger, describing observations made with his new telescope. These and other discoveries exposed difficulties with the understanding of the heavens that was common at the time. Scientists, along with the Catholic Church, had adopted Aristotle's view of the earth as fixed since Aristotle's rediscovery 300 years prior. By Galileo's time, the Aristotelian, Ptolemaic view of the universe had become fully integrated with Catholic theology. Scientists of the day largely rejected Galileo's assertions, since most had no telescope, and Galileo had no physical theory to explain how planets could orbit the sun, which, according to Aristotelian physics, was impossible. That would not be resolved for another 100 years. Galileo's peers alerted religious authorities to his errors and asked them to intervene. In response, the Church forbade Galileo from teaching it, though it did not forbid discussing it, so long as it was clear it was merely a hypothesis. Galileo published books and asserted scientific superiority. He was summoned before the Roman Inquisition twice. First warned, he was next sentenced to house arrest on a charge of grave suspicion of heresy. The Galileo affair has been considered by many to be a defining moment in the history of the relationship between religion and science. Since the creation of the conflict thesis by Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper in the late 19th century, religion has been depicted as oppressive and oppositional to science. Edward Dobb explains that, while 20th century historians of science dismantled White and Draper's claims, it is still popular in public perception. Casting Galileo's story as a contest between science and religion is an oversimplification, writes Geoffrey Foss. Galileo was heir to a long scientific tradition with deep medieval Christian roots. The Puritans, or Pilgrims, left England and established Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1628, so they could have the religious freedom to build their own churches and create an area with Puritanism as the established religion. They founded Harvard College 8 years later. Unlike the Spanish or French, the English colonists made little effort to evangelize the native peoples. Puritans supported public education, and in 1642, Massachusetts required parents to ensure their children's ability to read. In the Old Deluder-Satan Act in 1647, the state mandated community schooling, laying the basis for public schools in America. According to Robert K. Merton, the values of English Puritanism and German Puritanism and German Pietism led to the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Merton thesis is both widely accepted and disputed. Merton explained that the connection between religious affiliation and interest in science was the result of a significant synergy between the ascetic Protestant values and those of modern science. With roots in German pietism and British evangelicalism, and in order to counter the extreme rationalism of biblical criticism of the Age of Enlightenment, a revitalization of religious piety known as the First Great Awakening swept through the American colonies between the 1730s and the 1770s and 70s. Beginning among the Presbyterians, it quickly spread to Congregationalists, Puritans, and Baptists, creating American evangelicalism and Wesleyan Methodism. Moderates disapproved in battles over the movement, and its dramatized style raged in both congregations and denominations. This caused the division of American Protestantism into parties for the first time, which eventually led to critical support for the American Revolution. In places like Connecticut and Massachusetts, where one denomination received state funding, other churches now began to lobby local legislatures to end that favored treatment, separating church and state. The Second Great Awakening, 1800-1830s, led to the beginnings of the Mormons, the Restoration movement, and the Holiness movement, after having begun modestly in 1801 when over 25,000 people gathered to fast, pray, and take communion together in the small frontier community of Cane Ridge, Kentucky. That year, Lexington was the largest city in the state, with 1,795 people. Extolling moral reform as the Christian alternative to armed revolution, evangelicals established societies that operated separately from any church to teach the poor to read, suppress sexual vice and ungodly amusements such as cockfighting and bear baiting, and to abolish the slave trade. 53. These were pioneers in developing nationally integrated forms of organization, which produced the mergers and business consolidations that reshaped the American economy. The Third Great Awakening began from 1857 and was most notable for taking the movement throughout the world, especially in English-speaking countries. The final group to develop from the Great Awakening in North America was Pentecostalism, which had its roots in holiness movements and began in 1906 on Azusa Street in Los Angeles. Pentecostalism would later lead to the Charismatic movement. The beginning of American Protestant missions abroad followed the sailing of William Carey from England to India in 1793, after the Great Awakening. A great effort was also made to evangelize America. Missionaries played a crucial role in the acculturation of the American Indians. Restorationism refers to the belief that a pure form of Christianity should be restored using the early church as a model. In many cases, restorationist groups believed that contemporary Christianity, in all of its forms, had deviated from the true original Christianity, which they then attempted to reconstruct, often using the Book of Acts as a guidebook of sorts. Usually, restorationists do not describe themselves as reforming a Christian church, which has continuously existed since the time of Jesus. Instead, they describe themselves as restoring the church that they believe was lost at some point in the history of Christianity. Restorationism is frequently used to describe the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. The term restorationist is also used to describe movements such as Adventism, a movement which originated in the 1830s in the United States during the Second Great Awakening, when Baptist preacher William Miller first publicly shared his belief that the Second Coming would occur at some point between 1844 and the 1844 and the Jehovah's Witness movement, founded in the late 1870s by Charles Taze Russell. The term can also be used to describe the Latter-day Saint movement, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Let's-day Saints, the Youth Church, the Community of Christ, and numerous other Latter-day Saint denominations. Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, believe that Joseph Smith was chosen to restore the original organization which was established by Jesus, now in its fullness, rather than reform the church. The Russian Orthodox Church held a privileged position in the Russian Empire, expressed in the motto of the late empire from 1833, orthodoxy, autocracy, and populism. Nevertheless, the church reform of Peter I in the early 18th century had placed the Orthodox authorities under the control of the Tsar. An Oberprocurator appointed by the Tsar ran the committee which governed the church between 1721 and 1918. The Most Holy Synod, The church became involved in the various campaigns of Russification and was accused of involvement in Russian anti-Semitism, despite the lack of an official position on Judaism as such. The Bolsheviks and other Russian revolutionaries saw the church, like the Tsarist state, as an enemy of the people. Criticism of atheism was strictly forbidden and sometimes led to imprisonment. Some actions against Orthodox priests and believers included torture, being sent to prison camps, labor camps, or mental hospitals, as well as execution. In the first 5 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, one journalist reported 28 bishops and 1,200 priests were executed. This included people like the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, who was at this point a monastic. Executed along with her were Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich Romanov, the princes Ioan Konstantinovich, Konstantin Konstantinovich, Igor Konstantinovich, and Vladimir Pavlovich Paley, Grand Duke Sergei's secretary, Fyodor Remez, and Varvara Yakovleva, a sister from the Grand Duchess Elizabeth's convent. Recently released evidence indicates over 8,000 were killed in 1922 during the conflict over church valuables. At least 106,300 Russian clergymen were executed between 1937 and 1941. Beginning in the mid-19th century, new imperialism was a second wave of economic and political colonialism that lasted until World War II. During this time, colonial powers gained territory at almost 3 times the rate of the earlier colonial period, opening many new territories with some assurance of safety for Christian missionaries who soon followed. The 16th century had been the great age of Catholic expansion, whereas the 19th century was that for Protestantism. Protestantism initiated translations of the Bible into native languages, which supported the development of national literatures and was instrumental in generating a democratic legacy for many colonies. Translating developed a dictionary, a written record of native customs, spread literacy, mass printing, and developed voluntary organizations. This profoundly impacted native cultures in Africa, which responded with movements of indigenization and cultural liberation. According to Sana, that means Western missionaries began the largest, most diverse, and most vigorous movement of cultural renewal in the history of Africa. Although contact with Christian missionaries might have had beneficial long-term effects for human capital, political participation, and eventually democratization, contact with the colonial slave trade has had pernicious effects. Liberal Christianity, sometimes called liberal theology, is an umbrella term covering diverse, philosophically informed religious movements and moods within late 18th, 19th, and 20th century Christianity. The word liberal in liberal Christianity does not refer to a leftist political agenda or set of beliefs, but rather to the freedom of dialectic process associated with continental philosophy and other philosophical and religious paradigms developed during the Age of Enlightenment. Fundamentalist Christianity is a movement that arose mainly within British and American Protestantism in the late 19th century and early 20th century in reaction to modernism and certain liberal Protestant groups that denied doctrines considered fundamental to Christianity, yet still called themselves Christian. Thus, fundamentalism sought to re-establish tenets that could not be denied without relinquishing a Christian identity, the fundamentals. Inerrancy of the Bible, the principle of sola scriptura, the virgin birth of Jesus, the doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Under the state atheism of countries in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, Christians of many denominations experienced persecution, with many churches and monasteries being destroyed, as well as clergy being executed. The position of Christians affected by Nazism is highly complex. Pope Pius XI declared, mit brennender Sarge, that fascist governments had hidden pagan intentions and expressed the irreconcilability of the Catholic position and totalitarian fascist state worship, which placed the nation above God, fundamental human rights, and dignity. His declaration that spiritually Christians are all Semites prompted the Nazis to give him the title Chief Rabbi of the Christian world. Catholic priests were executed in concentration camps alongside Jews. For example, 2,600 Catholic priests were imprisoned in Dachau, and 2,000 of them were executed. Priesterblock. A further 2,700 Polish priests were executed, a quarter of all Polish priests, and 5,350 Polish nuns were either displaced, imprisoned, or executed. Many Catholic laymen and clergy played notable roles in sheltering Jews during the Holocaust, including Pope Pius VI. The head rabbi of Rome became a Catholic in 1945, and in honor of the actions the Pope undertook to save Jewish lives, he took the name Eugenio, the Pope's first name. A former Israeli consul in Italy claimed, "The Catholic Church saved more Jewish lives during the war than all the other churches, religious institutions, and rescue organizations put together." The relationship between Nazism and Protestantism, especially the German Lutheran Church, was complex. Though many Protestant church leaders in Germany supported the Nazis' growing anti-Jewish activities, some such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor of the Confessing Church, a movement within Protestantism that strongly opposed Nazism but strongly opposed to the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer, a pacifist, was later found guilty in the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler and executed. On 11 October 1962, Pope John XXII opened the Second Vatican Council, the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. The council was pastoral in nature, interpreting dogma in terms of its scriptural roots, revising liturgical practices, and providing guidance for articulating traditional church teachings in contemporary times. The council is perhaps best known for its instructions that the Mass may be celebrated in the vernacular as well as in Latin. 23. Ecumenism broadly refers to movements between Christian groups to establish a degree of unity through dialogue. Ecumenism is derived from Greek oikumene, which means the inhabited world, but more figuratively something like universal oneness. The movement can be distinguished into Catholic and Protestant movements, with the latter characterized by a redefined ecclesiology of denominationalism, which the Catholic Church, among others, rejects. Over the last century, moves have been made to reconcile the schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Although progress has been made, concerns over papal primacy and the independence of the smaller Orthodox churches has blocked a final resolution of the schism. On 30 November 1894, Pope Leo XII published Orientalium Dignitas. On 7 December 1965, a joint Catholic-Orthodox declaration of Pope Paul VI and the Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I was issued, lifting the mutual excommunications of 1054. Some of the most difficult questions in relations with the ancient Eastern churches concern some doctrine, i.e., filioque, scholasticism, functional purposes of asceticism, the essence of God, hesychasm, Fourth Crusade, establishment of the Latin Empire, uniatism, to note but a few, as well as practical matters such as the concrete exercise of the claim to papal primacy, and how to ensure that ecclesiastical union would not mean mere absorption of the smaller churches by the Latin component of the much larger Catholic Church, the most numerous single religious denomination in the world, and the stifling or abandonment of their own rich theological, liturgical, and cultural heritage. With respect to Catholic relations with Protestant communities, certain commissions were established to foster dialogue, and documents have been produced aimed at identifying points of doctrinal unity, such as the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification produced with the Lutheran World Federation 1999. Ecumenical movements within Protestantism have focused on determining a list of doctrines and practices essential to being Christian and thus extending to all groups which fulfill these basic criteria a more or less co-equal status, with perhaps one's own group still retaining a first among equal standing. This process involved a redefinition of the idea of the Church from traditional theology. This ecclesiology, known as denominationalism, contends that each group, which fulfills the essential criteria of being Christian, is a subgroup of a greater Christian church, itself a purely abstract concept with no direct representation, i.e., no group or denomination claims to be the church. This ecclesiology is at variance with other groups that indeed consider themselves to be the church. The essential criteria generally consist of belief in the Trinity, belief that Jesus Christ is the only way to bring forgiveness and eternal life, and that Jesus died and rose again bodily. In reaction to these developments, Christian fundamentalism emerged as a socio-political, religious movement in rejection of what many Christians perceived as radical influences of philosophical humanism that were affecting the Christian religion, according to them, especially targeting critical approaches to the interpretation of the Bible and trying to blockade the inroads made into their churches by secular scientific assumptions. Fundamentalist Christians began to appear in various Christian denominations as numerous independent movements of resistance to the developments that they regarded as a drift away from historical Christianity. Over time, the evangelical movement has divided into two main wings, with the label fundamentalist following one branch, while the term evangelical has become the preferred banner of the more moderate side. Although both strands of evangelicalism primarily originated in the English-speaking world, the majority of evangelicals today live elsewhere in the world. World Christianity, otherwise known as global Christianity, has been defined both as a term that attempts to convey the global nature of the Christian religion and an academic field of study that encompasses analysis of the histories, practices, and discourses of Christianity as a world religion, and its various forms as they are found on the 6 continents. However, the term often focuses on non-Western Christianity, which comprises usually the exotic instances of Christian faith in the global South, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It also includes indigenous or diasporic forms of Christianity in the Caribbean, South America, Western Europe, and North America. In many colonial societies after World War II, Christian missionaries played a transformative role in the development of decolonization, moving former colonies toward independence. In the post-colonial world, it has become necessary for Christianity to break free of its colonial moorings, says Sana